Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Dr. Victoria Sweet. Sweet is an Associate Clinical Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and a prize-winning historian with a doctorate in medical history. She practiced medicine for 20 years at Laguna Honda Hospital in San Francisco. Sweet's published work includes the book Rooted in the Earth, Rooted in the Sky, Hildegard of Bingen and Pre-Modern Medicine, and a number of essays and op-ed articles on medical care and the history of medicine, including Hildegard of Bingen and the Greening of Medieval Medicine. In her most recent book, God's Hotel, A Doctor, a Hospital, and a Pilgrimage to the Heart of Medicine, Sweet describes how her patients and her work at Laguna Honda Hospital shaped her ideas about healing and the practice of modern medicine. Sweet spoke on God's Hotel, A Doctor, a Hospital, and a Pilgrimage to the Heart of Medicine as the Oregon Humanities Center's 2013-2014 SEDEC lecturer in both Eugene and Portland on March 5th and 6th, 2014. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me first, how did you come to be a doctor? What was your path to becoming a medical practitioner?
Well, I'm not really anything I would think of as a natural-born doctor, as a matter of fact. So growing up, I had friends who loved, looking at your owies and, volunteering in hospitals, and they knew everything about Dr. Kildare, but I didn't want to have anything to do with it. Nothing to do with it. But what happened was, towards the end of college, I ran into the writings of Carl Jung, particularly his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself, and I had this strong science bent, and I had strong humanities bent, and when I read his book and realized the way he had put them together was as a psychiatrist, and then I realized what a really interesting life he had. That's what I decided I would be, and that's how I got to medical school, actually, sort of purely fortuitously.
So, but you're not a psychiatrist, are you?
No, I tried to be. And so I went to medical school, and I kind of gradually noticed while I was in medical school that I didn't mind touching people, and in fact it was really fascinating. The what we call the workup, the history where you sit down with the patient, that was the psychology part, and it wasn't really what patients said, it was what they didn't say, and where their eyes would go, and how there were so many interesting things. I think one of my favorite things was realizing that, and they did a study about this, that it's the third thing that the patient tells you that's the real reason that they come in. Fascinating. And then the physical exam where you touch patients, it was just fascinating because the body, disease writes its message on the body, and you can read it like a text. So the idea that I could make diagnoses just by examining a patient, I loved. And the whole method of the whole thing. But I still went and tried to be a psychiatrist in the only locked ward in our county, and they were not Jung's kind of patients. And at that point I had my license, and I decided, you know what, I'm just going to go out and practice medicine and see what happens.
So you were practicing medicine. What made you decide to get a PhD in history? Where did that idea come from?
Well, I was practicing medicine in a really not such unusual places, but fascinating places. So where I never wanted to have a private practice. I had to admit, I always felt guilty about not having a private practice. It seemed like if you're a real doctor, you should have a little private practice, and I just didn't want to. So I had jobs usually, especially my first job was in a county clinic. And I just loved it. Because the county clinics, I don't know what it's like in Oregon, but in California, they're county clinics run by the counties, and they just take everybody. They're more or less free. And everybody comes in there, and they come with everything. So you just see everything in my textbooks. And a lot of people, especially at that time, they waited a long time. So their disease was written on their body, and I could diagnose it. The better a clinician was, the better physical exam I did, the more often I could diagnose it. And we got patients who came also, of course, many, many immigrants, and they came in with all their really interesting diseases. But they also came in with their different ways of looking at the body. And by that time, I'd been practicing for several years, and I began to sort of get a sense of what was different about their ways of looking at the body, and got really interested in finding more out about that. And I also kind of came to terms with what was fantastic about Western medicine in specific. Our method, our logical method to get at a diagnosis, our ways, all their tests, wonderful. but anything that didn't fit got avoided. And so I kind of felt like there was a piece, and I think part of it was my Jungian kind of training, this idea that you have a shadow side, and that the alternative medicine is really the shadow side of the West, and until we put those two together, until we recognized our shadow, we would be incomplete. So I started studying Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine at that point, alternative medicines and homeopathy and naturopathy. I mean, not in a program, but at least on my own for starters.
So, okay, so how did you get from, because I mean, I live in Eugene, I go to a number of alternative practitioners, and they always say, oh yeah, the doctors, they have no tolerance for us. They think we're charlatans. So how did you get from studying homeopathy to a PhD in medical history?
Well, what happened was pretty much I'd been looking into all these things, and there's particularly like homeopathy and naturopathy were interesting, but they didn't have enough sort of. And then I looked in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, and there had a lot of them. But there was a sense that I decided that, with one particular moment, I decided I would never really understand this alternative viewpoint of the body unless I understood the language that it was being taught in, and probably the culture. So I actually thought about going to China at that time and learning Chinese medicine, and I just thought, even if I learned it in China, even if I learned Chinese, it's such a different culture. I'm the same thing with learning Sanskrit. In India, not so much, but still. So I was kind of floating around, literally in the library one day, floating around kind of in the HQ section, and this book kind of popped out at me, and it was Hildegard of Bingen's Medicine, which turns out to, I'm looking at that, it had just been translated from the Latin that she wrote it in, into German, and then from German into English, and I'm finding out that she's this 12th century nun, and a mystic, and a visionary, but she'd also written this book on medicine, and I'm reading it, and it's a lot like herbal medicine. It really was, but it was from the West, and it clearly had a different model of the body in it than our model, and yet there was something similar about it. So that, when I read that book, I was just like, you know what, I have to understand this. And so I decided I would go get my PhD at that point. And I was practicing medicine at the time.
So tell us a little more about Hildegard in particular. How is her medical practice different from the kind of medical practice that you were being trained in as a Western doctor?
Well, it took me many years to sort of, there are ways in which it's similar too. It's from a practical point of view, it's not that different, actually. It's kind of interesting if you sort of step back. I mean, I realized eventually she would look at a patient, she would vibe them out, she'd take their pulse, because she didn't have a blood pressure cuff, but she'd feel their head, she'd get a temperature, right, of some kind. She'd look at the owie, she'd do her examination of it, and then she'd write a prescription, really. And her prescription were herbal medicines, mostly. But most of our medicines up until about 5 minutes ago were herbal medicines of one kind or another. I mean, now we use synthetic versions of them. So the ways in which it was very similar. But the way in which it was different was how she looked at the body, what she was doing with the body. And what I realized eventually is that the way in which I had been trained to look at the body was as a mechanic. The body's a machine, and I'm looking to see what's wrong and how can I fix it. And that Hildegard's way was to look at the body as if she were a gardener, and that the body was a plant. And so what did that mean really? It was like she put her patient into the context of his environment. Now, that context she had was based on a different model of the body, more like the Chinese model with earth, air, water, fire, and hot and cold and wet and dry. So she was trying to keep the body in balance. So it was very actually similar to Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine in the theoretical sense.
So how did you come to work at Laguna Honda? How did you get there?
Well, I came there kind of accidentally too. Although now I probably should say serendipitously, but it certainly seemed accidentally at the time. So I wanted to go back to school, and I didn't want to stop practicing medicine, and so I had to find a part-time job. And I actually spent a couple of months trying to find a place that would let me work part-time. Now, so today, that's really not too much of a problem, but this was more than 20 years ago. It was so interesting because I'd walk in there and say, oh my God, thank God we have a woman doctor, fantastic. We have so many, we can't find any women, you know, great, sign here. And I'm like, great, but I only want to practice part-time. They were like, oh no, you can't practice part-time. I'm like, well, no wonder you don't have any women doctors. You know, hello. So I spent months, and finally there was somebody at this really weird hospital called Laguna Honda Hospital in San Francisco that I knew a little bit about because I had admitted patients there before, but I didn't really know anything about this place except it was called a hospital, and if you could get your patient there, you usually never saw them again, and I didn't know why. So on the phone, we talked, and the medical director, who I call Dr. Major in the book, said, oh sure, we don't have a part-time job, sure, come on over. And I'm driving over there, and it's right next to UCSF, okay? It's right next to University of California, San Francisco. But I'm coming down the different way, and I look up and I see this, like, it looks like a medieval monastery on a hill, really. I kind of like that, you know, it's kind of interesting. And I drove up, and I met Dr. Major, and she showed me around, and it was just a fascinating place to practice medicine. It was huge. It was on 62 acres of land.
I looked at it on the Google Maps. It's gigantic.
It's gigantic.
It's like, what's it doing in the middle of San Francisco?
In the middle of San Francisco. And it was built on this old Nightingale plan, built in the 20s, and I really remember walking around with her today and just going like, whoa. So when we got back to her office and she offered me the job, I was like, I'll come for 2 months. I'll come temporarily. And I ended up staying there for like 20 years, and it changed me. It was just an incredible experience to be there and to be doing what I was doing with this other part of my life at the same time.
So how did it change you?
You got that question again. Oh, it changed me at a lot of different levels, but it took a long time for me to realize it was a very special place. And I get a lot of emails and letters from people who support that, and usually when I'm giving a talk, there's always some person at the talk who says, I worked there, I was a patient there, I had a family, and they'll tell a story. So it's not just me. It was a very special place. It seemed to, so it was built in the 20s, but it was built on, the hospital had been there since the 1860s when San Francisco was founded, which was 1862. And it was founded as the San Francisco Almshouse. The almshouse was how we used to take care of the sick poor before you had health insurance. And so it was right out of Dickens. I mean, talk about Nightingale, right? And for some reason, the almshouse tradition actually goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. Because in the Middle Ages, there weren't hospitals. There was no health insurance. And who took care of the sick poor was the monks and the nuns as a vocation. And that sense of taking care of the sick poor as part of a vocation was somehow transmitted. I used to think at Laguna Honda in the architecture of the place, which was very medieval. And it kind of got into my skin after a while, this sense of kind of this, I hate to use the word magic because it really wasn't magical, but it was spiritual maybe. It was just this sense of connections between people, of when in the book I talk about, I gradually realized about charity and community and hospitality. Here today we're all talking about, Healthcare Act, you like it, you don't like it, yada, yada, yada. But I think nobody's sort of, from a historical perspective, what's fascinating about everything in this country with medicine is that we all agree that taking care of the sick poor is something we should do. We're really just discussing different ways of doing it. And that hospitality, that sense of, that's where hospitality comes from, hospitalitas, right? Of being hospitable and welcoming the poor and taking care of the poor as part of your vocation is all part of Western culture. And it's a beautiful part, and it just got into me after a while in the place.
Interesting. So the book is called God's Hotel. Why? Why God's Hotel? Yeah,
well, of course, I got a lot of I get a lot of interest from religious people, and it ties into what we we're just talking about, because God's Hotel I took from an almshouse in French. So Laguna Honda was an almshouse. But in French, the word for almshouse is a Hotel Dieu. That's what they used to call hospitals for the sick poor. We used to call them that. In English, they're still God's houses, Usually they're called God's houses in English. So the Hotel Dieu translates as God's hotel. So I like that because it really meant almshouse, but it really captured, I mean, there was a reason they called it the Hotel Dieu. It's the hotel of God. It's where God shows up.
That's so fascinating. So you talk about hospitality, and for, I think a lot of people who go through the modern American medical machine would not think of that word as the first word that would come to your mind. You know, we're in there, you know, I mean, you wait and then you see the doc for, I don't know, 5 minutes, and then doc is gone, and not hospitable at all.
No.
So what was it like working at Laguna Honda? It wasn't like that, was it?
Yeah, no. Well, it was really, I'm going to use the word fun. It's probably not the right word, but I think of fun as being something that you wake up in the morning and you're glad to do. And even though it's really hard and, you know, taxing would be the right word, it was exciting, but it was also really satisfying because it was old-fashioned. So really, we were over the hill to the poorhouse. There literally is a hill, and Laguna Honda was there, and the city, even though it's in the middle of the city, over there. And for the years I was there, mostly I was on the admitting ward. And so it was a big old, long, old-fashioned Nightingale ward, 30 beds, a sun solarium at the end, the head nurse at the beginning, and there was one particular ward where all the patients who would come to Laguna Honda would come through the admitting ward. And I was one of the doctors who would take care of them. And so that's all I had to do, is admit this patient, and I had the patient for as long as I wanted, both on that particular day and for, sometimes they'd stay on the admitting ward for weeks, sometimes months. So what I had is I had all the time in the world to take care of them.
That never happens in most hospitals.
No, it was so, well, you know, it actually used to. And when I say used to, when I went to medical school, that's the way it was. I mean, the doctors would take, and it, you know, that's just how it was. And so it's kind of interesting going back to going to Laguna Honda, because it was really like opening the door on 20 years ago. It wasn't like 100 years ago, but just 20 or 30 years ago, we had nice paper charts, and we had as much time as we wanted. And I could talk to you and examine you and call your doctors up and look at all your records and try things out and figure out what's wrong with you, and then go back and see you again. And the miracle of it is when I had enough time with patients, and it wasn't just me, but everybody there, they got better. They got better when they weren't supposed to get better. A lot.
Seems inefficient.
Yes, well, it's my key word. Yes.
So tell me why that's your key word.
Long live inefficiency.
Tell me why, what's so important about inefficiency for you?
Well, what I just discovered this great slide that I'm going to probably use tonight when I talk, or, you know, the next time I talk. And it shows that in terms of inefficient, right? Efficiency is the buzzword. We're all supposed to be efficient. And everything that's been happening the last 40 years, or no, 20 years, has been for efficiency. Oh, doctors are so efficient, nurses are so efficient. And what's ironic is it seems to me what I've seen is the more efficient we get, the more it costs, and the fewer patients we see over and over again. The more efficient it is, the less efficient it is, in fact. And what I saw at Laguna Honda was the opposite. Everybody left us alone. It was terribly inefficient. The HICVA would show up and the Department of Justice would show up, and they were just shocked by the plays. And yet what I saw is that patients got better, they were on fewer medications, we used fewer tests, and that it was fundamentally not just that the inefficiency that we did was cost effective and fundamentally efficient, as well as being satisfying and hospitable. And so my big thing is to, like everybody, wake up and smell the coffee. Right? I'm sure it's true as an English professor. I bet you're having to fill out forms and how many students and yada yada, and all that takes time from you actually being able to do what it is that you really love to do and what works for your students, which is to turn them on to English literature of the early 1900s, I believe.
So you say wake up and smell the coffee. So how come nobody's smelling the coffee? I mean, what you're describing, that's not what's happening now in the American medical system, isn't it? I mean, what happened to Laguna Honda? Tell me what happened there.
Well, we were discovered over the hill to the poorhouse. One day, first healthcare efficiency experts showed up, which was really actually interesting because there was a big move. This was in about 15 years ago, so this was the first step, right? I know the problem is it's actually what they're doing right now right this very instant with the DRGs for post hospital care. So the idea is that the economists determined that if we would give you a lump of money to take care of this patient and like leave it up to you to figure out what to do with the patient, that you'd be more efficient. That was the idea. So that's what they started to do. And so Laguna Honda had to come up with this. They were going to, instead of getting paid per patient, we were going to get paid this sort of lump sum. And so nobody knew how that was going to work. So the hospital administrators hired healthcare efficiency experts to come to the hospital. And that was sort of the first moment at which they're walking around and they're looking at things like our greenhouse, our aviary, our little barnyard, our little pigs that would visit the patients. And we had a live-in priest. They were pretty horrified. And I particularly loved, in the terms of efficiency, how their contract was worded. So they got 10% of any inefficiency they could find. Right? But they didn't have to pay any money back if the inefficiency they found and took away actually ended up costing more money, which is what in fact happened. So by the time they left, they had decreased, for instance, the number of head nurses in half, and we started to get more falls, more bed sores, more admissions to the hospital, but nobody ever calculated that out. So we eventually got really discovered, and the old hospital was closed. San Francisco built a beautiful new, according to code, hospital, and now is on so the new Laguna Honda is to some extent on the same kind of rat race, although a little slower rats, in terms of getting lump sum for patients, and therefore that's all the money you have, so you've got to get them out of the hospital as soon as possible, because that's part of what's actually happened.
So I know that you have read the Affordable Care Act.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously have strong opinions about where medicine is in the United States today. What's your prescription for our medical system?
I want to put inefficiency back into healthcare. And what I mean in specific by inefficiency is giving doctors back the time they need to do a good job. And I think we could start by having an experiment. In fact, I hope that some insurance companies are out there paying attention, because I think they can save money. So why not give a model, why not just do it as an experiment? Give some of your docs as much time as they want with their patients, and then, you know, they've got all that big data. Let them compare whether it's cheaper or not when a doctor doesn't have to send you for the MRI at $2,000, because they have the extra hour, which costs $200, to examine your back and be sure you don't need the MRI. So if doc has 3 minutes to examine your back, I'm going to order an MRI. But if I have an hour, I probably won't, if I don't need it. But I can't tell it I don't need it in 3 minutes. So I think it's cost effective, and I'm just waiting for the insurance companies to approach me.
It's amazing to me, though, that if it is cost effective, that they wouldn't have approached you, since you would think that their desire would be to get the cost down.
I know. Well, I think two things about that. I think it is cost effective, and why not have a trial of that? And there is that whole concierge movement that's going on that's actually providing the data. So anybody who looks at that, my guess is what's going to happen is that concierge model will be adopted by the insurance companies, because that doesn't even require anything fancy. And doctors, thousands of doctors in the last few years have dropped out and are doing a concierge model, and that data is really available pretty clearly. I mean, you have the doc before they did it, and you have it after. The doc's taking care of fewer patients, has more time with the patients, and saves money because he has time to do a good job. The patient's happy, the doctor's happy, and it's cost effective. So I think what's going to happen is the insurance companies will start first offering the concierge model as an upgrade, just like a business class model. But the fact is they're going to see that it actually is pretty inexpensive to do that. And so what I'm really waiting for, what I really want to do, is a concierge model for the sick poor. Because that's actually where we could save money, really.
So just explain a little bit more about what a concierge model is.
So it's called by all kinds of different names, and actually you have them up here, and sometimes they call direct patient care. It's a horrible name, but anyway, it's catchy. So what happens is the doctor who's now taking care of 2,500 patients, that's what an economist has determined one doctor can take care of. That's insane.
That's why 3 minutes.
It's insane, 2,500 patients.
Yeah.
If you have 1% of your patients who are sick, 99% of your patients aren't terribly ill. You have 25 patients who are dreadfully ill, it's impossible. Okay, so a bunch of docs are saying, well, a lot of docs are just dropping out. They're saying, oh, fine, we'll retire early. But the docs who can't do that are saying, you know what, I can take care of, and usually it's anywhere between 50 patients and 600 patients. And I need to take, and in order to run my practice and make a living, I need X amount of money. And so they just divide X amount of money by the number of patients they're taking care of, and it comes out to usually between about $100 and $200 a month, depending on how they do it. And they ask the patients to pay that up front. So it's a lot like community-sponsored agriculture, where the farmer gets upfront money. I don't know if you know about community-sponsored agriculture, from their clients, and the farmer doesn't have to go to the bank and borrow money. It plants, it cuts out the middleman. Everybody wins. It's the same kind of idea. The patients upfront pay $100 to $200 a month, and the doc's only taking care of 250 or 300 patients. The doc can do things like, when you have to go to surgery, go with you to the surgery. Look at the pathology on your slide with the pathologist. I mean, it's so much better. Docs are so much happier. The patients are happier. And it's, what are we talking about, $2,500 a year? I mean, that's not, if it's one MRI scan they save, and they save a lot more than that. That's concierge medicine.
Fascinating. And your model is that could be extended to the sick poor.
That it should be, because if anybody is spending a ton of money, I mean, this is what I took care of at Laguna Honda. And you could say in some ways we had a concierge model. I had a fixed number of patients, more or less fixed, and I had enough time to do those things. And the kind of things I was able to do, I mean, my average patient who would come to Laguna Honda, having been all over the city, and they were the sick poor, would be on between 15 and 26 medicines. They didn't need them. They only needed about 5 of them. But nobody ever had the, who would risk it? A patient walks in, I'm not going to take you off 5 of your medications and realize you no longer have hypertension. The diabetes was an overreaction to something. You're on a prostate shrinking medicine and you've had your prostate removed 3 years ago. So just that alone, that difference would easily pay for a concierge model.
So I'm really sorry to say that we're out of time, but thank you so much for taking the time. It's been fascinating. I've been speaking with Dr. Victoria Sweet, Associate Clinical Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She gave a lecture based on her book, God's Hotel, A Doctor, a Hospital, and a Pilgrimage to the Heart of Medicine, as the Oregon Humanities Center's 2013-14 SEDEC lecturer in both Eugene and Portland on March 5th and 6th, 2014. Thanks for watching.